The judge didn't even look up when the old man in chains was brought in. Just another homeless black veteran, another waste of court time. At least, that's what everyone thought. But within the next 10 minutes, that courtroom would fall silent. Not because of violence, not because of chaos, but because of one quiet truth that no one saw coming. And by the time he spoke, no one in that room would ever forget his name again. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold coffee, the kind of scent that clings to silence and judgment. And as the bailiff opened the side door, you could feel the room shift, not out of respect, but out of rehearsed indifference. That's when he entered. Shackled at the wrists, limping from a leg that never healed right, 68-year-old Jeremiah Walker stepped forward. Head slightly bowed, but not in shame. No, it was the kind of tilt you earn from carrying too many names in your memory. He wore a heavy military coat too big for his frame, patched, faded, and covered in the kind of dust you can only get from sleeping beside stone walls and broken promises. His face was tired but not defeated, and when the bailiff nudged him toward the defendant's chair, he paused, not for dramatic effect, but like a man who'd walked into this kind of fire before and didn't flinch. You could tell from the way the clerk sighed while reading out his charges that they thought they had him figured out. Trespassing, resisting arrest, loitering near a federal site. The usual list they toss at the forgotten. But no one asked why a man like Jeremiah would choose to curl up beside a VA hospital in the dead of winter. No one wondered what kind of ghost would lead a man to sleep with nothing but a dog tag around his neck and a rusted medal in his pocket. They didn't see the story. They only saw the sentence they were waiting to give. And in that moment, without speaking a word, Jeremiah Walker had already begun to change everything. Judge Raymond Hollis didn't even look up when Jeremiah's name was called. His honor was the kind of man who had long stopped seeing individuals and only saw docket numbers and time slots. Another vagrant who thinks he owns the sidewalk, he muttered, flipping through a stack of cases like they were receipts at a dry cleaner. But when he did look up, it was with a sneer that said more than words ever could. He let his eyes rake across Jeremiah's ragged coat, the dog tags clinking slightly with every breath, the boots with soles nearly flapping open. "You planning to wear that uniform to court, Mr. Walker?" the judge asked with a scoff, and a few people in the back snickered. You could feel it, the judgment, the assumptions, the entire weight of a system that decides your worth by your appearance. The judge's smirk deepened when Jeremiah didn't respond. No permanent address, no family contact, no defense attorney. Sounds like we've got ourselves a regular troublemaker. But the truth is, that coat he mocked once carried a man bleeding on his back across an open field under mortar fire. Those dog tags? They belonged to a friend who didn't make it home. And those boots had marched across the desert with a spine made of grit and duty, not courtroom approval. But none of that mattered here. Not to this judge. Not in this room. Because sometimes people get so used to hearing echoes of their own authority, they forget what real silence sounds like. Especially when it comes from a man who knows the price of speaking and chooses instead to endure. Toward the back of the courtroom, in the fourth row, sat a woman whose silver hair was tied in a neat bun, her gloves still clutched in her lap, as if she hadn't decided yet whether to stay or leave. Her name was Linda Kerrigan, and though no one noticed her at first, her eyes hadn't moved from Jeremiah Walker since the moment he entered. Something in the tilt of his head, the slow gait, the way he held that coat around him like a flag made her heart tighten in her chest. "It can't be," she whispered under her breath. Not after all these years. She was only a child in 1979, a little girl trapped in a burning car just outside Fort Bragg, when a soldier had pulled her from the wreckage and stayed with her until the firemen arrived. He'd wrapped her in his coat, told her to breathe slow, and vanished before anyone could even thank him. That memory had lived in her dreams for decades, never clear enough to identify, but never fading, either. And now here she was, sitting in a courtroom, watching that same calm, steel-eyed face being paraded like a criminal. The judge didn't know. The clerks didn't know. But Linda? She started to remember. And that memory wasn't going to let her stay seated for long. As the prosecutor rattled off the case facts with the dry detachment of a man reading a grocery list, he paused only to drink water, not even looking at Jeremiah, as he said, "Your Honor, This man was found sleeping behind the VA memorial wall again. That's federal property, restricted access, and he's been warned multiple times. We recommend 90 days to give him time to reflect on his behavior. The judge nodded without much interest, but as the camera panned, because of course, everything's documented these days, you could see Jeremiah raise his head just slightly, like a man listening for a distant train. The prosecutor went on, saying something about how emotions don't trump the law, and public resources aren't therapy sessions for old war stories. The word stung, but not because they were cruel. They stung because they were hollow, and hollow words in a courtroom built on sacrifice echo differently. Jeremiah never blinked, never interrupted. He just sat there, looking past the judge, past the prosecutor, as if he was seeing a battlefield that had once been his own. They didn't know the full story. They didn't ask why he slept next to that memorial every Veterans Day, why he wore the same coat every year, why he always placed a small photo, folded, laminated, barely visible, at the base of the wall before sunrise. That wall wasn't just stone. It was memory. It was sanctuary. It was the last place he saw his brothers alive before the world moved on and left them in names and dates. And now they wanted to sentence him for going home. When Jeremiah raised his hand to speak, softly, slowly, like a man who knew how to speak without making noise, the judge rolled his eyes. "You can speak after we finish wasting court time," he said, not realizing that court time had already been wasted long before Jeremiah walked in. You see, this wasn't just a case about trespassing. This was about memory, about a system so bloated with protocol that it forgets to check for the truth. And that's when it happened. As Jeremiah's hand remained raised, the judge barked, "Denied. You'll get your say after we read your record, what little there is." He turned to the clerk. Next docket item. Wait, there was a stir in the gallery. Linda Kerrigan had stood up, clutching a small leather-bound book, her voice cracking but clear. "Your Honor, that man isn't just some vagrant. He's a war medic. He saved my life when I was 5 years old." The courtroom froze. Every eye turned. The judge looked annoyed, but the bailiff didn't move to silence her. "He pulled me from a car wreck outside Fort Bragg. No camera crews, no medals. He just left. But I never forgot." The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was heavy. A silence that creaked like old floorboards under the weight of truth. Jeremiah didn't move. He didn't nod, didn't weep. He just sat there, like a soldier in formation, waiting for someone to finally see what had always been there. The judge stiffened slightly as the woman's words echoed across the courtroom, but he masked it with a scoff, waving off her statement like smoke in the wind. "Miss, we don't have time for sentimental outbursts. This is a court of law, not a memoir circle," he grumbled. But even his voice cracked on the last word. Jeremiah hadn't looked at her. Not yet. He didn't need to. He knew the voice. He remembered the child, bloodied and gasping, his arms around her as the fire licked closer. He remembered handing her off to firefighters and vanishing into the chaos because heroes didn't wait around for applause. They moved on to the next fire. Still, he said nothing. Let them talk. He'd learned long ago that truth doesn't always need defense. But then the judge leaned forward with that condescending courtroom smile, cold and syrupy. "Let's be clear, Mr. Walker. Hero or not, the law doesn't bend for nostalgia. You broke federal code. You resisted arrest. You trespassed. We're not putting up monuments here. We're upholding order." That's when Jeremiah finally looked up, his eyes dark but steady, and what the judge saw in them wasn't fear. It was something older, something crusted in decades of war, loss, and silence. It was the look of a man who had seen men die for flags and then watched those flags get folded and forgotten. The judge didn't like that look. It didn't flinch the way guilt prefers. Behind the prosecution table, Assistant DA Jared Colby flipped through his papers, increasingly uncomfortable. "Your Honor," he said, grasping at a more professional tone, "regardless of past service, Mr. Walker's presence on restricted property violates clear federal policy. We recommend a 90-day sentence to deter repeat incidents and preserve the integrity of our system." He sounded like a textbook, but his voice was hollow, like someone trying to recite rules from a book they never wrote. But then something unexpected happened. Bailiff Mason, a 20-year court vet with a chest full of pins from police veteran coalitions, took a single step forward. Just one. "Sir," he said cautiously, "I believe my father served with Jeremiah Walker. 3rd Battalion, Gulf War." He spoke of a medic they called Bones, who patched up 12 men under fire, including him. The courtroom's tension cracked like a dry branch underfoot. The judge narrowed his eyes. "This isn't the time for stories, bailiff," he said sharply. But his voice trembled slightly now, unsure if this trial was still under his control. Colby turned pale. Linda Kerrigan stepped closer to the railing, holding her leather-bound scrapbook tight to her chest. "I still have the coat he wrapped me in," she said quietly. It smelled like smoke and bravery. The room was still. Every cough, every chair creak, every breath now felt amplified by what was no longer deniable. Jeremiah Walker was not who they thought he was, and the courtroom was beginning to feel it. Suddenly the side doors burst open, and a nurse in blue scrubs rushed in, clutching a stack of papers and an ID badge flapping against her chest. "Sorry," she gasped out of breath. "I was told he was in custody. I had to find him." The judge's gavel hovered in the air. "And you are?" he asked impatiently. She stepped forward and placed the stack of papers on the clerk's desk. "I'm Nurse Camille Rojas. I work at the VA hospital. Jeremiah Walker was a registered peer counselor with us until 2 years ago. He used to lead our grief and trauma circles for new vets. We lost contact after," her voice cracked, "after his son Elijah died by suicide." A ripple of quiet grief moved through the courtroom. She pulled a worn folder from her bag and placed it gently on the bench. He didn't break into that sight. He returned to the wall where his son's name is engraved. He was just trying to be near him. On the anniversary. She looked at the judge directly now, voice steady. He wasn't loitering. He was grieving. That sentence, just that, hung in the air like a hymn. The kind that makes old soldiers lower their heads without realizing why. You could feel the floor shift. Not physically, spiritually. The courthouse, once so sterile and unforgiving, was being peeled back layer by layer, revealing the rot underneath. The judge leaned back in his seat, suddenly far too small for his black robe, fiddling with his gavel, as if it could rescue him from the guilt setting in. "Mr. Walker," he muttered, "why didn't you explain all this sooner? Why not call someone? Bring a lawyer? Ask for help?" Jeremiah tilted his head, calm as ever. "Because every time I've asked for help," he said softly, "it's come too late. And I didn't come here to beg. I came here to sit beside my boy." The rawness in his voice cut through every wall of legal jargon, every assumption, every dehumanizing word that had been tossed his way. "I didn't resist arrest. I resisted forgetting. And I didn't trespass. That ground is hallowed. I bled there. My son's name is carved there. I taught rookies how to cry there. That wall holds more truth than any of these files." No one moved. Not the court reporter. Not the DA. Not even the judge. Because they all knew this wasn't a man looking for sympathy. This was a man looking for dignity. And the court had almost stolen it from him, piece by piece. Jeremiah finally reached into the inside of his coat and pulled out a small, laminated photograph. A younger man in fatigues, smiling beside a flagpole. "This was Elijah," he said. "Brighter than me. Braver. He wore the same boots, same name, same blood. And when he couldn't carry it anymore, I buried him with my own hands. Every year, I sit beside that wall and tell him I'm still trying." The room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath since he walked in. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers trembling. You could feel something different in the air now. The scent of judgment had turned into the scent of regret. And for the first time, Judge Hollis couldn't meet the defendant's eyes. Not because he felt attacked, but because he felt ashamed. What do you do when the man in chains teaches you more about honor than any oath you ever took? You listen. And that's what they all did. Quietly. Finally. The judge cleared his throat, but the room didn't give him permission to speak. His authority had shrunk beneath the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid, And now even the gavel looked like a prop in the hands of a man who'd lost control of his stage. He turned to the DA, grasping for procedural ground. "Are we ready to proceed?" he asked. But Jared Colby said nothing. His face had gone slack with realization, as if he was finally seeing the man before him. Not the charge sheet, not the mugshot, but the full, unfiltered story. Then the judge sighed, shoulders deflating like an old tire, and he picked up his pen with trembling fingers. "Mr. Walker," he said with forced calm, "the court recognizes your prior service and the circumstances surrounding this case. All charges are hereby." But before he could finish, Jeremiah slowly stood. "Don't do that," he said gently. "Don't make it a gesture. Don't frame it as a favor. Just tell the truth. Tell them I belong there." The room was stone still. "Don't let the next man who comes in looking like me get dragged like I was. Don't wait for someone to stand up before you see him." There was no fire in his voice. No demand. Just tired truth wrapped in worn leather boots and a coat heavy with years. It wasn't mercy he was after, it was memory. And he wasn't going to let the court forget. Just then, the courtroom doors opened again, not with the crashing drama of a movie, but with the soft whisper of someone who moves with purpose and not permission. In stepped two men in uniform. One wore the stripes of a Marine Corps sergeant, the other a younger VA counselor with a folder in his hand. The counselor approached the judge and handed over the files silently, nodding toward Jeremiah. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we've verified everything. Mr. Walker's years of voluntary trauma work, his leadership citations, even letters from families he helped during the pandemic. He was never homeless. He just stopped checking in after Elijah's death. We've been trying to find him for months." The judge scanned the folder slowly, each page another nail in the coffin of his assumptions. Attached at the back was a photograph of Jeremiah, years younger, standing with soldiers under a banner that read, "Healing Through Brotherhood. VA Outreach 2005 to 2019. The judge closed the folder, eyes moist now, and simply nodded. "Case dismissed," he murmured. But it didn't feel like a dismissal. It felt like surrender. Because the courtroom hadn't just misjudged a man. They tried to bury a living legacy. And now that legacy had come walking in with dust on its shoulders and truth in its hands. There was no applause, no dramatic cheering, just a silence so pure it felt like penance. The spectators, one by one, began to stand. Not in protest, not in celebration, but in reverence. A slow rising of heads and hearts, each person coming to terms with what they'd witnessed. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, hands clasped together like someone who just walked out of a church service. Jeremiah didn't gloat, didn't even smile. He just reached into his coat one last time and pulled out Elijah's dog tag, kissed it gently, and placed it on the clerk's desk. "He served too," he said. "Don't erase that." The clerk nodded through tears. And that's when Linda Kerrigan stepped forward, her scrapbook now open, revealing a yellowed newspaper clipping from decades ago. "Unknown soldier saves child from fire." And beneath it, a blurry photo that could have been anyone, but it wasn't. It was him. She turned it toward the judge and laid it beside the file. "Now you know," she said softly. "And now you'll never forget." The judge, for once, said nothing. Jeremiah turned to leave without ceremony, walking with the same quiet steps he entered with. But this time, the silence followed him like a banner of respect. Outside the courthouse, the winter air hit his face with that crisp sting only veterans know, the kind that wakes you, humbles you, and reminds you that pain isn't always something to avoid. Sometimes it's something to carry. And waiting for him outside were faces he hadn't seen in years, brothers in arms, younger vets he once mentored, and even strangers holding folded flags across their hearts. No chance. No cameras. Just stillness and nods of acknowledgement, the kind you only give to someone who's walked through hell and come back with their honor intact. Jeremiah placed one hand on the memorial wall just outside the courthouse steps, a replica of the one downtown, and whispered, "I told your story today, son. I did it right this time." A wind passed through, cold but clean. He nodded once to no one and started down the steps, not free, but whole. At the threshold, he paused and looked back, Not at the judge, not at the prosecution, but at the empty bench where so many others like him had sat, misread, mislabeled, discarded. He lifted his eyes to the gallery and said just 7 words. Start listening. Start seeing. Start remembering us. No bitterness. No vengeance. Just a request from a man whose truth had finally been heard. And maybe that's how justice walks, not with parades or proclamations, but in worn-out boots, carrying nothing but memory, sacrifice, and the simple, enduring weight of dignity.